So in honor of this precious time we have together, I'm going to abbreviate the introduction and ask Riane Eisler, Dr. Riane Eisler, to join us join me up here on the stage. For decades, she's been a leader in the movement to raise the status of women worldwide, not only as an organizer, but by using her legal training to strike down discriminatory laws and expand human rights protections to women. She's best known in this movement for her book, The Chalice and the Blade, and that's also now in 25 foreign editions. And she now has a recent book, The Real Wealth of Nations. And we thought that that work and her research was so relevant to the theme we have this year that we've invited Riane to come up, and she and I are going to have a little exchange and interview for the next. Thank you, Riane, for joining us. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about your ideas on how we can redefine and value the role that women play in the world and how we measure our economic contributions and our growth. But before we talk about your books and your research, tell us what's inspired your passionate interest in culture, economics, and social justice.
Well, first, I really want to thank you for that wonderful speech. You know, what you really exemplified in it is what I call partnership leadership, which is not controlling, not exclusionary, but on the contrary, inclusive, engaging, validating, and inspiring.
Thank you.
And I think that, well, she's going to be a wonderful leader and is a wonderful leader. And I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But you asked me about myself, and yes, I do have a passion for social justice, and that is not only through my research and my writing and my activism, and even not only as a mother and grandmother, deeply concerned, as so many of us are, about what kind of world our children will inherit, but it's a passion, as you pointed out, it's rooted in my life experiences too. And I'll just briefly tell you about that because I was born in Europe, in Vienna, at a time that in terms of the new conceptual framework that I've introduced of a partnership or domination system was a massive regression to the domination side. It was the rise to power of the Nazis, first in Germany, and then in my native Austria. So from one day to the next, my parents and I, we became hunted with license to kill. And on Crystal Night, so-called, because of all the glass that was shattered in Jewish homes and synagogues and businesses, a gang of Gestapo men came to our house and dragged my father away. So I witnessed, as a very young child, cruelty, violence, but I also witnessed something else, something that I today call spiritual courage. You know, we're told about courage, that it's the courage to slay the dragon, kill the enemy, but spiritual courage, well, it's courage to stand up against injustice out of love. And that's what you're doing, by the way. And that is what my mother did that night. She recognized one of the men who came as a young man who had been an errand boy for the family business, and she got furious. She said, "How dare you do this to this man? I want him back." Now, she could have been killed. A lot of people were killed that night. But by a miracle, she wasn't. By a miracle, she later obtained my father's release. By a miracle, we were able to obtain a visa to Cuba. And I grew up then in the industrial slums of Havana because, of course, the Nazis confiscated, that's a legal word, an official word for robbery, right? Everything that my parents owned. And it was also there that I found out that most of my relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, had been killed in the Holocaust, as would have happened to us. And it was that really led to my research, my multidisciplinary, cross-cultural historical research to answer a question that I'm sure many of you have asked: does it have to be this way? But I didn't embark on this research until another pivotal experience in my life. And that was in the late 60s, when along with thousands of other women, I suddenly woke up as if from a long drugged sleep. And I realized that certainly being born Jewish it almost cost me my life, but that having been born female had also tremendously impacted my life. So when I embarked on my multidisciplinary cross-cultural historical study, it was from a gendered perspective.
Amazing, yes. Well, that's important, and that leads us to, we had I had a lot of questions prepared, but because of time, we're gonna, you wrote about The Chalice and the Braid, which really was a groundbreaking book that looked at the intersection of gender and race and humanity and culture, and all the social constructs that form society. And now in your new book, you kind of take that analysis and to another level with looking at new ways of looking at economic models and the feminization, the typical feminization sector of our economy that's so undervalued and not factored in. We heard some of that this morning from Dr. Sassian, but I'd like you to talk about how you go beyond just quantifying the feminized work, but really looking at transforming the way in which we talk about economy.
Let me backtrack for just a minute, because I want to say something. We're used to studies that are quite aptly called the study of man. And then we're told, don't worry, man includes woman. Well, of course, in English, the word woman includes man. But that's not the point. The point is that if you don't look at the whole picture, you can't see configurations. You can't see the whole picture. You can't connect the dots, okay? And we're in a very complex era where we have to start connecting the dots. And using this approach of drawing from a database that includes the whole of humanity, both its female and male halves, it is really possible to see configurations cross-culturally, historically, configurations that transcend the conventional categories, right-left, religious-secular, Eastern-Western, Northern-Southern. You know, a colleague of mine calls these weapons of mass distraction because they fragment our consciousness, and we can't see something that, once you articulate it, seems perfectly self-evident, because they don't pay attention to this, that how a society constructs the roles and relations of the female and male halves of humanity is not just something that directly affects our individual life choices, but that it affects everything about the society, our beliefs, our values, every institution, from the family, whether it's more democratic or authoritarian, to religion, education, politics, and economics. So I am going to get to your question.
Yes.
This conference is really about empowering women, but also about peace and social justice. And my research, and now increasingly the research of many others, is showing that the two are inextricably interconnected. And that we cannot really succeed unless we make some very fundamental changes. And here I'm talking now about economic systems, because if you think about it, in the first part of the women's movement, and I was very involved in that. I mean, I threw myself into the women's movement, formed all kinds of organizations, wrote the Equal Rights Handbook. The worst was that it got defeated, the Equal Rights Amendment. All kinds of things. But I began to understand that what we really need is systemic change. And that's where you come in, fundamental change, okay? Because in the first part of our movement, economically, we try to get, well, a bigger slice of the existing pie, right? And we don't have such a big slice, but we have something. I mean, a conference like this would have been impossible in the late 60s or 70s. You know, I mean, it's always wonderful for me to be at something like this, to see that, yes, we have moved forward, but we know from our own experiences, even those of us who are fortunate to have good jobs, to have good businesses, that we face enormous obstacles and that we simply cannot, under the present economic rules of the game, balance life and work. It's just, we can't, no matter how many self-help books you read. You know, it's just not going to happen. So we have to really move, and this is where you come in and your leadership comes in, to a second stage. A stage where we, again, try to do something from which we were barred. just as we were barred from the professions, which is to have a say in the economic rules of the game, which were made, think about it, without taking into account the needs, the aspirations, the contributions of nothing less than the female half of humanity. So we have to really get beyond this socialism versus capitalism argument, retain the best elements of both, and move to an economic system that is the only way that we can change the shameful fact that worldwide women are the mass of the poor and the poorest of the poor. That even in these wealthy United States, women over the age of 65 are twice as likely to be poor as men over 65. And it's not just job discrimination. It's because we have not had, and this is where a whole new way, I mean, I'm really asking you to do something we hear so much about, which is to think outside the box, okay? To think of what we really need. And we need an economic system that gives visibility and real value to the most essential human work, the work of caring for nature and the work of caring for people starting in early childhood. The work that is still, yes, considered, quote, women's work, for which we're mainly responsible, and which has to receive much more recognition and support in both the market and non-market sectors. And this can be done. I mean, why should professions that involve caring and caregiving, like childcare or elementary school teaching, be paid so much less than professions that don't? It's a question of values that we've inherited, isn't it? From what I call a domination system, and a central component of that is the ranking of the male half of humanity over the female half, and the devaluation of anything stereotypically considered soft or feminine, okay? And if we don't really address this issue, and I'm trying to compress a lot into a short answer, we will really remain marginalized, because what we need are economic measurements that show the enormous value, economic, not only human value, but the enormous economic value of this work. You know, the Swiss, which I always like to bring in because they're not exactly the most radical nation in the world, they did a survey showing that if the work of caring and caregiving, the household work, were included in Swiss GDP, it would constitute a whopping 40% for 0%. Now, it's invisible, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So not only do we have discrimination in the market, but we have the fact that this work is simply not counted, not valued. And we've got to change this, and we can. And there are nations that have moved towards this. Nations like Sweden, Finland, Norway have very generous paid parental leave, government supported, for both mothers and fathers. They have a huge investment in high quality early childhood education. They have stipends to help families. They have in Norway Social Security credit for the first 7 years of caring for a child at home, whether done by a woman or a man. We can have these policies, and we have to. And this is why we have such a great opportunity. The old economic system